So I'm Michael Weaver. I am an architect and identity management specialist with Concensus Technologies. We do a lot of work in education, both K-12 and higher education. I specifically focus in solving issues related to identity management, the provisioning of accounts and identities from sources of authority, and sending those accounts and identities and related information out to other systems for account provisioning, permissions management, group memberships, all that good stuff, centralized password resets and things like that. One of the challenges that we always face when working in education, particularly in the higher education space, which is going to be the primary focus of my discussion today, is the concept of roles. When one starts to do a larger IDM, identity management type of engagement or design, one of the things you want to think about is roles. You can usually generalize the IT experience that a particular individual needs or has in terms of their accounts and their permissions across the enterprise by what role or function they serve or are known by the organization. Businesses do this quite a bit in terms of if you're an accountant, you get access to the accounts payable and receivable information. If you work in engineering, you might get access to the prototyping equipment, so forth. Those are all examples of roles. In the education space, we also want to approach things from a role-based perspective. I wanted to go over just a quick overview of what I'm talking about and why we would find this interesting. Why in the world are we going to want to look at roles? Roles works very well in an IT provisioning infrastructure where we can give or tag collections of accounts and permissions around this concept of a role, around this organizational classification, if you will, for users, and thus simplify the job of managing IT resources for these people. We're always pressured, particularly in higher ed and K-12, to do more with less. You're lucky if you have even 5 or 6 full-time people for many places, or even less. I've seen school systems run either 1 or 2 full-time IT. You don't have time to deal with micromanaging everybody's specific account and everybody's specific permissions. Being able to define a role-based solution where you can say broadly that all students get this, all faculty get that, all staff members that are not teaching faculty get this other thing. Makes your life a lot easier. Auditors and compliance officers really enjoy this perspective as well. You can then say that since so-and-so holds this particular job responsibility or is in this particular role, they have the ability to do X, Y, and Z and no more. We can easily track when people get access to these systems through their role assignments and role removals, as well as ensuring separation of duties in that, say, for instance, with an expense system, somebody who can submit expenses other than also the approver of those same expenses. A separation of duties configuration, which can be done through a good role system, will ensure that these sorts of conflicts of interest don't arise. A little bit different in the education space over the business space, and I'll call out some of those differences when we get a little bit further along. The classical model, at least in the identity manager, the NetIQ Novell product, approach to work to roles is through the request and approval model, using workflows through the user application, which is a web-based tool that people log into to either request additional accesses or additional roles be added, or to approve or deny or otherwise manage that role experience. Further, this particular solution does offer a time-based model, which is of interest to a lot of businesses. If you want to, say, grant, say one of your people is going on vacation and you wanted to grant their role to somebody else briefly, you can set an expiration date on it, grant it over, they get all the permissions, and then it's automatically revoked after the time period is ended. And there's quite a great deal of reporting options available for compliance auditing, reporting, and tracking. Those are some of the reasons why we might look at implementing roles within Identity Manager from the business perspective. A lot of these still apply to the higher ed space, particularly when you're dealing with FERPA data. You want to be able to perhaps categorize FERPA, which is a United States privacy law that deals with who has access to student data and whether or not students' information is available outside the university or to various subpieces of the university. Just to cite an example, or HIPAA for healthcare, if a higher ed institution that also does health services. To compare and contrast a little bit between the academic and the business approach, to let you know, the Novell NetIQ product is built entirely around the business role approach. One of the things I'm hoping to bring to you today is a little bit of an idea of how you can pound it with a hammer until it becomes a little more friendly to the academic space. Some of the key differentiators between academic and business roles types. The academics tend to be a little more fuzzy. It's a little unclear precisely how this particular role is defined. Who is a faculty member? Well, is it anybody who teaches? In that case, does graduate students count as faculty as well? Because many undergrad courses are taught by grad. How about visiting faculty, researchers who are a tenured professor but don't actually teach classes? What about emeritus? Do they count as faculty, etc.? Students are similarly problematic. How long does it have to be since a user has had a course before we no longer consider them a student? Even something as seemingly straightforward as graduation can be very difficult to nail down. Businesses, on the other hand, tend to have fairly crisp definitions by job role or job responsibility. If you're an accountant in accounts payable, it's pretty clear what you need access to. You're not going to need access to the building key card system. You're not going to need access to the modal pool or the transit data, things like that. Academics also, probably one of the most singular differentiators of academic roles is the overlaps. It is entirely possible and expected for somebody to be, at the same time, an undergraduate student, a graduate student, a faculty member, and an employee, and a retiree. I've seen these cases. They exist. Universities tend to foster a more inclusive mood with the way that the people are handled. And part of that's related to fuzzy definitions. But whenever you define roles for academics, you need to be aware that there's a substantial portion of your population that are going to end up being in one or more roles. And we need to account for that in our design. Businesses tend to go a little more exclusive in their roles. You are an accountant. You're not accountant and a custodian at the same time. You are an IT sysadmin. You're not an IT sysadmin and a marketing person. There are a lot of exception cases. Anybody who works in education knows that the suitably powerful professor, tenured faculty, what have you, tends to get what they want. No matter how well you define your rules, there is somebody that's going to defy them. And you need to be flexible as an IT provider to allow for these edge cases. When you end up doing identity management work, as the rule of thumb in the industry goes, you end up spending 90% of your time on 10% of the cases. The edge cases tend to dominate the way you design and build and implement these things. You need to be aware of them, and if you allow for the edge cases, the exceptional cases, from the get-go, it tends to make the overall project simpler and more successful. Businesses are often driven by compliance, Sarbanes-Oxley and related regulations that have made it necessary that they be able to document who has access to what data, when they have it, and when they lose it. From onboarding to offboarding, it needs to be tracked and auditable at all points. And the role-based provisioning solution really provides that. We tend to see in academics it's a little more service-driven. We need to make sure we're servicing our customers, being the students and the faculty and the staff, enabling them to accomplish the mission of the educational institution. Academic institutions also tend to be quite decentralized. There may be a central IT organization, but there's often departmental or school-based IT. There's often deans and department heads that have their own approaches to solving problems. A suitably flexible role model can work with that, but it's something one that's taken into account during the design process. Businesses tend to use a more organizational chart, hierarchical approach to these things. There's a manager, there's a division, there is a branch. There's a clear chain of command and authority to where you can get approvals for variance. You need to get an approval for a variance in academic, who proves that? we tend to go to deans and department heads typically, but it's not always clear if you have a student who is in multiple schools at the same time, who approves their variance? The student affairs person for school 1 or school 2? Well, don't know. Those are some of the fuzzy definitions I mentioned before. So the challenges we face when looking to implement identity management roles in the educational space are those fuzzy definitions. What makes a student a student? Has it been that they took a class within the last calendar year? If they take 2 terms off in a row, does that stop making them a student, or are they a student until they assert that they are no longer a student? Or perhaps a 5-year timeout has occurred. Even something as simple as graduation doesn't seem as clear as you would think. Even after a student has graduated, they may continue to take courses at the university, either pursuing another degree, moving into a graduate program, or just for general continuing education. Do they still qualify as a student? Sure. Would they qualify as an alumni? Very likely. You need to make sure that those cases work well together. I mentioned the faculty case. Is it only people who teach, or is it some sort of an HR job role that says these types of people are employees and these types of people are faculty? Role transitions are a big one that challenge educational designs. When do we transition people into and out of roles? And more to the point, what impact does this have on their IT environment? You don't want to be in an environment where unexpectedly to IT and to management, a user loses access to a key system because their role data shifted. On the other hand, you don't want to have a user kicking around with lots more access than they need because they've transitioned out of the role that required it. Some of the things you need to weigh when working on role designs. Once you've come up with the basic role ideas and the entitlements that they grant, whereas an entitlement is the permission of the ticket to allow an account to be provisioned or a set of permissions to be granted, how do you implement that on the technical level? The IDM-4 request approval model is a little awkward for higher education for some of the reasons I already mentioned. You really don't want students flocking to a website to request that they be granted the student role. It just doesn't seem reasonable. Faculty are generally not going to be bothered. They're going to want to have all that stuff taken care of for them as our employees. We want to be able to automatically assign these roles based upon some identity information, but that gets tricky with their fuzzy definitions. Get into a little more technical detail on what Identity Manager 4 Advanced Edition, this is the RBPMS solution. It comes out of the box with 3 basic types of roles. Business roles, which are the most general, or the closest to the person. Then IT roles, and finally permission roles. IT roles you can think of as collections of accounts or permissions that make sense from an IT perspective. For instance, if you're wanting to provision Active Directory and Active Directory groups and exchange accounts to a class of users, you might make an IT role of AD with Exchange. And then it has all of those particular resources associated with it. Permission roles are the closest to the application level. They may include account roles, particular group memberships, particular types of the permissions, dependent upon the environment. Resources represent entitlements. They represent things that you're granting access to. They could represent a conference room. They could represent a physical object in real world, or in the context of what we're talking about today, they can represent accounts, permissions, group memberships, basically driver entitlements. When attempting to design roles, there are 2 main approaches that people fall into. One is the top-down approach, which is starting from the human side of it, with the broadestly scoped roles as possible, things like student, staff, faculty, alumni, employee, things like that. Then one determines what is the correct set of resources or permissions to give to that broad role. Then we get more specific as needed. for exceptional cases. You start with the broadest set. All students get X, Y, and Z. Then maybe you get more specific. College of Arts and Design get, A, B, and C in addition to the students. So they might get a more specific role in addition to their student role. Graduate students of that college may get another more tightly defined set of rules. So you drill down from the broad definition from the human perspective down to the most specific definition necessary. I would strongly urge you, if you are attempting to do this, to design your roles to allow them to be overlapped. You will find an astonishingly high number of overlap cases, students who are also staff and faculty at the same time. Another approach is the bottom-up approach, where you start from the IT perspective. These are the accounts we have that we need to grant provision or grant entitlements to. Which ones are in scope? Active Directory, Google, GroupWise, file and print services on OES. Those might be the initial set that you build from. Then from that, we build into a more of a role-based model. Well, everybody who gets a Active Directory account, we'll call them the AD account role. Then we assign that to every student or faculty member or only faculty and staff. So we start from the application side and work our way forward. When defining these things, we need to also document and capture how these roles are identified and how people change between roles during the identity life cycle. How does a student become a staff member? How does a staff become a faculty member? How does a faculty member become an emeritus, et cetera? A business partner of ours and good people, Big Sky Associates, have recently published an article about defining roles in higher education, which I found to be very interesting, and I encourage you to read it. The link is at the bottom of this page. I pulled this material from their site with permission. This is one of their approaches where they advocate a hybrid approach, where you approach your role design from both a bottom-up and a top-down approach, possibly at the same time or with two teams doing a tag team approach, or separately. When one is doing a top-down, one typically approaches the key stakeholders and interviews the key personnel and figure out what the organization needs are. You also look at your data sources. Are you working with banner provisioning or PeopleSoft Campus Solutions or something like that as one of your data drivers? What you have available to react to may well drive part of this. The bottom-up approach, you work with the application owners, Google Apps administrator, your Active Directory administrator, so forth and so on. In this particular example, they're working with banner roles, students, staff, and so forth that come out of the banner integration. There's a variety of ways to approach this, and this is a nice one in that if you have this kind of separation or definitions being generated by, say, your student information system and your HR, that makes it easier from the IT side to design these roles. The burden of ensuring that people are legitimately in those roles falls to the people that are responsible for the data, and that works often as a reasonable approach that gets most of the stakeholders to agree. Sometimes you have to impose these roles from the IT perspective, and that's where getting these key stakeholders together to talk to them. Would you be comfortable if we define student as having qualities A, B, C, and D? Or does it work to define employees as having qualities 1 and 2, and so forth? You get their buy-in and approvals fairly early in the process so you don't end up with a lot of pushback when you start acting on these role changes. Just an example, I know that the details aren't legible, and that's intentional for the protected guilty in this case. This is a example provisioning flow model from a college that I did some work with about 1.5 years ago. And this is a relatively small college with a very small student base and faculty base, all located in one physical campus. But you can see just with the banner data alone, that's what the leftmost point is, the banner. how many different role identification cases we had to deal with and how many decisions we ended up having to make if they are an existing faculty member and they gain the student information from Banner. What do we do? Well, we don't change their status to student. We keep them as faculty because we don't want them to lose them. But we do note that they have students so that they can get into Blackboard, for example. Things like that. Building state models and flow diagrams like this early in your design process can be very helpful in helping express to the key stakeholders what you're trying to accomplish and what the impact of these decisions are going to be. When discussing role transitions, users transitioning in and out of various role states, these are things to consider, and they're good questions to carry forward to your data owners and to your stakeholders. For instance, under what condition does the person become a student? Is it when they apply to the university? Is it when they are accepted? Is it when they go through registration? Is it when they pay their fees for the first time, when they've actively matriculated? Conversely, when do they stop being a student? They haven't taken a course for a year or 2 years. They transfer or something like that. That's actually a surprisingly hard problem, and every university has had challenges that I've worked with and had challenges really rigorously defining the no longer a student case. How do we define becoming an alumni? Is it that they walked for graduation? Should that preclude student status? Probably not. They've got multiple degree programs. How do they become faculty and so forth? Probably the simplest case is employee. We can usually tell when they get hired and fired, but you also need to track, do you count student workers? How about internships? If they're working without getting paid, they may not show up in HR, but they still need employee role data. Data is often stale and ambiguous in colleges and universities. Oftentimes, universities end up fairly balkanized, where you get one data feed that shows your current course enrollment data, but that is not trued up with your current student financial data or not trued up with your HR data. So you end up having to deal with sometimes a lot of disparate data sources, and it's important to get everybody on the same page to find out, well, if this data source says that they're a student, this data source does not. Which one's authoritative? How do we reconcile those differences? Further, you'll sometimes find, for instance, if you start doing a provisioning of new accounts or existing accounts from HR or from student information, that you have out-of-date naming information. Maybe the names, the first and last name, are their legal ones. They're not the ones they want to be known by. So these are issues to capture fairly early. One thing I would recommend, if you're looking at a role transition model where you're losing access or losing accounts, say they're transitioning from a full-time staff to not a staff member, but they are a student, they might conceivably lose their exchange or group-wise account or something to that effect. Before you pull that trigger in an automated fashion, it might be a good idea to inject a manual approval step during your role transition implementation that goes to somebody, just to sanity check that. It's a pretty bad day when the system gets a data influx that you didn't expect or is badly formatted, and suddenly every employee loses employee status and they all get their accounts deleted. I've seen stuff like that happen. We don't want to go there. So if you're going to do any kind of a state transition that results in loss of services, particularly if it's a somewhat irrevocable loss, like a deletion of a email account where the mailbox contents are lost, it's worthwhile to go through the effort of adding perhaps a manual approval or at least a notification in the delay to act as a sanity check. Moving into some technical implementation details, if we were looking to implement this in an environment with Novell's Identity Manager, what might we do to make it happen? There's a couple of key approaches one can take. One of them is using the role-based entitlements, or RBEs, which are, at this point, somewhat legacy. They were IDM 3.6 and prior, I think, to 3.0. I may be wrong on that. Role-based entitlements are a method of adding an entitlement, which, to give a little definition, an entitlement is a message or an indicator for a driver that authorizes a user to get an account, be made a member of a group, or what have you. I like to think of them as tickets. You give an entitlement to a user, you give them a ticket. And if they get a ticket, then they can go and take a ride on the Active Directory train. They get an account. You give them another ticket, they get a member of the group. You take the group ticket away, they lose their membership to the group. So entitlements are the effectors, the levers that a role system uses to influence the drivers so that they can add or remove the accounts or permissions. Generally, it works like dynamic groups where you define an LDAP search filter, a search base, a scope, and some membership criteria. And when users match that, they are granted the entitlements that you define in the RBE. A different model, and this is the model Novell/NetIQ is using moving forward, is the workflow-based solution on the roles-based provisioning modules, RBPMS. This was available as an add-on in IDM 3.6 and 3.7, and is now part of the IDM 4 Advanced Edition moving forward. It uses a web application called the User App, and is a workflow-based solution where you trigger an addable role. A workflow is generated, sent to somebody for approvals, or maybe nobody, depending on how you work it out. And when fulfilled, it grants them their entitlements. And it can include things like dates and times and things like that. I'll show you a little bit more about that in a minute. Role-based entitlements, as I mentioned, use an LDAP search filter and the entitlement services driver, as noted here, to set and manage entitlements. It's relatively simple to set up. It has a few weaknesses. One of the weaknesses, you are limited to just an LDAP search filter, which, while powerful enough, you can build up compound matching rules where you say, you know, if their object type is user and their UDC institutional roles are student and their, you know, first name is Joe, then they get this entitlement. They have some weaknesses as well. You can't do or can't easily do things like, and their end date is not expired. Time-bound checking is not one thing that the LDAP filters and RBEs don't do very well at all. So if you're looking to track things like expiration dates or things like that, it's difficult to do those in an RBE. It also has scaling issues. It's got a particularly large environment, many thousands and hundreds of thousands of users. RBEs just, they get chunky after a while, and it can take quite a long time to process. You can only have one RBE driver in a driver set, so you can't even go massively parallel with it. The newer shipping drivers in the 4 series use a new formatting for their entitlements, which are not particularly compatible with RBEs. So Novell is moving towards a different format to support roles and resources with the RBPMS. You can still make them work by changing the entitlements or creating new entitlement objects, but it's becoming less of a supportable option. Finally, it doesn't really provide you a good set of role-based features. For instance, it doesn't give you that auditing and compliance. It doesn't give you the separation of duty. It doesn't give you the delegation for limited time. Those are all features that you may end up wanting. I haven't seen them as much in the higher ed space, but you may end up wanting them down the road. The roles-based provisioning module is based around the web application user app, which is a JBoss application that runs on a Windows or Unix server, Linux server. It has an engine that monitors the directory through the roles and resource service driver and user application driver, and will enable people to request roles or administrators to assign roles and subsequently resources to users, which grant and revoke their permissions. in accounts appropriately. One of the big weaknesses of this model is that it does not really do automated assignments very well. One of the big benefits of RBE is that you could just say, give everybody whose, institutional role is students these accounts, and bada bing, you would go, and that handled your students. This doesn't have a functionality like that right out of the box. I was going to show you a couple of ways to do that. There's a few ways you can do automated roles with RBPMS, and one is through the dynamic group model. You quite literally create dynamic groups that are built much like you would build an RBE. Then you assign the role in the role management tool to that dynamic group. And whenever the user app refreshes its members list, the roles get assigned and revoked. It's simple. I would not recommend it for a large environment. It really doesn't scale very well. The more users you have, the slower that refresh time becomes. And it's not really a near real-time solution. Role assignments don't occur until the next refresh cycle. It could be quite a while sometimes. The faster you set the refresh, the slower user apps can be. It also isn't particularly flexible. It suffers from the same problems that RBE does in terms of things like time bounding and more complex matching criteria than can be done through an LDAP filter. A more advanced solution, but one that we've implemented for several customers and I'm particularly fond of, is to use IDM drivers to add roles. So using any IDM driver can do this. Loopback drivers, null drivers, it's commonly done in things like the banner driver. You can actually have it use the action tokens, add role and remove role, where it calls out to user app through web services and instructs it to, what's not actually through web services, goes through the roles and resources driver, but it instructs it to assign this particular role to this user. One of the benefits of this is you can use the fairly powerful matching set or condition set that Identity Manager brings to the table for testing whether or not a user should get that role. You can also have it do things like send email notifications or stop and yell for help when it finds that there's a problem and things like that. It's a little more complicated to set up, but it's a model that I'm very fond of and I think is very well indicated in the higher ed space. As we start to wind down a little bit, we're heading into the home stretch. I want to leave a little time for questions. I want to leave you all a couple of keys for success that I have found in my practice of doing these sorts of things in the education space. One is to do your homework, do your prep work. One of the common mistakes I've seen is people will get approval to do the project, they'll get the software licenses, they'll download the ISOs, burn their DVDs, and they'll start installing and clicking on things right away. That really will not lead you where you need to be unless you're just looking to learn the product. You're much better off taking the time to actually understand the business processes, the way students exist, the way faculty exist, what is their life cycle, how do they enter the system, how do they leave the system, what state changes might they have that are interesting. Get all that stuff nailed down and get a good design put together before you even start spinning disks. Spend some time with your student information people, your registrar's office. Spend some time with your HR people. Spend some time with your faculty coordinators and the graduate school people and understand how their users move through their system. When do they first know about them? When are they confident that they're affiliated with the organization? How do they know that they're no longer affiliated with the organization? And from that, you can build your role assignment business rules. Get all of the people who have skin in the game to the table. Maybe your provost or your vice president for student affairs or something like that would be a good person to have, at least at the initial high-level discussions. Get your student information system representatives. Get your HR representatives. Bring your Active Directory administrators. Bring your eDirectory administrators. all the people to whom you're provisioning accounts. Get them all together, and then you can present your vision, you can present your design and get buy-in. And that will sharply increase your chances of successful implementation. You can get them at least in basic agreement with what you're trying to do. Don't be afraid to reinvent some of your processes. It may be that your employee onboarding process is not going to be well suited to this role-based provisioning. It might be worthwhile to float the idea of changing that process a little bit to better accommodate the role-based provisioning. And finally, any attempt to start bringing this role-based provisioning or roles model into an organization is much more likely to succeed if you start small. Start with a few key successes, a few pain points that are most problematic. Provisioning students to Google or Live@edu or whatever. That's generally a good entry point. Make your goals small so you can get quick successes that build confidence in the system and in your ability to design it, which you can then use for follow-on to add more interesting material to your solution. Plus, once you show that it works and is causing things to be better for not only the IT staff, but for the constituency, the people that are using it, you'll find that other app owners and other departments start coming to you wanting to get a piece of it. And that ends up improving your overall function. I appreciate your time, and I'm glad that I had this opportunity to talk to y'all and share this with you. Let me